A very good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to your MOCA Weekly Town Hall. I'm Max, that's Daim, that's Coborn, and I just had this thought run through my head in a panic. We put that little graphic on the countdown that looks like this. I heard the music, but I was bent over eating yogurt, and I thought, how funny would it be if like that music was playing, but I was just like hunched over the camera just eating yogurt. So anyways, how we doing, gentlemen?
Maybe next time. Like next time we can orchestrate it with intention.
Honestly, that'd be a pretty good intro.
Yeah.
How are you guys doing? What's new? Do we want to jump right in? Do we want to back for a sec about geopolitics?
Still alive, still kicking.
Yeah, definitely. Every day is more. What do we say? Maybe some sort of
Fantastic.
existential creep.
I was like, there's no way this is going to be a positive adjective, is it?
Fantastic.
Okay. Why don't we start here? Because the two things that we just talked about before we got on the town hall were foundation and the bitter end, and Daim's divergent opinion from mine and Pindar Van Armen's, which has been the topic of, I think, the last two town halls, which was Michael Pollan's book, A World Appears, about consciousness. So, Daim, do you want to have this argument now, or do you want to have this argument later?
I guess we can have the argument now. I don't know if it's necessarily a wholly divergent opinion. You asked me if I liked the book, and I began with hesitation because the one part of the book that I categorically disliked was the chumminess. Possibly this was more of an issue for me because I was cheating. I was listening to the book in audiobook form, read by the author himself.
Mm-hmm.
And it just felt like there were a good many intermittent reminders that he was writing his book for a general audience that needed occasional bits of poking fun at things that I suppose one would expect a general audience to find worthy of being poked fun at.
Well, so I agree with you, but I think it's important to keep in mind, and again, not an argument, but I think it's important to keep in mind that the book was written, I think, predominantly between 2024 and 2025, because it was published earlier this year. So. And I guess this spins out into a question, which is, you've obviously been dealing with AI systems and AI, agents in some form for years now. Do you think that like this past year, like I guess the past year after this book would have been finished, was the most kind of instructive or enlightening to you about the possibility of AI, sentience, consciousness, etc.?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I have used AI from fairly early on in my art practice, not heavily if you go back far enough, but it was definitely something that was present from early on. However, in many ways, I was for a long time like, I'm not going to say I was an AI skeptic because I don't think there was ever a time when sort of AI skeptic perspectives made sense to me. But for a long time, I had, I guess a whole bunch of maybe partly common, maybe partly non-standard concerns around AI, and like some of them were like cultural concerns about AI, generative AI accelerating cultural erasure, which I don't think it's a solved issue, but it's certainly a less blatant and obvious issue than it seemed to be in the early days. Like even now, obviously AIs will know most about whether you're talking about image generation or whether you're talking about LLMs. AIs will know most about the stuff that's of greatest interest and preoccupation for the average West European or North American English speaking person. And everything that isn't is sort of progressively lower on the scale of priorities, and presence in the training data and all that stuff based on distance from places and cultures of power. I think that is a lot less of an issue now than it used to be. It still definitely is a factor, and it's still happening, and I'm certain it will still have its negative impacts in a variety of ways. But like there was a time when just even fairly basic things that seemed like should be known were just borderline absent from training data. And things that I tend to check now, at least tend to have presence enough that on the LLM side at least, the AI has some reasonable notion of how to begin to compensate by doing additional research online. And it's not just complete void absence that initially receives the unexpected question. But I had that issue. I always have and still think that if we're talking about AI models, I don't think any of them are conscious. I don't think any of them ever were conscious. I don't think any of them ever will be conscious. If we're talking about AI models like LLMs, what changed for me significantly on that front is I have come to see largely, as a result of, my experiences and interactions and, sort of architectural building and messing around with agentic software suites that, run my AI agents, as well as, actually some of the recent reading or listening to this book. I have come to see agentic software embedded agents, as in not the underlying LLM, because the underlying LLM is like with 100% clarity and no ambiguity around it. The underlying LLM is basically role playing.
Yeah.
And if you look at the reasoning content that generally gets discarded before the output is produced that users actually tend to see, if you look at the reasoning content, it's 100% unambiguously clear that the LLM is effectively, to varying extents depending on how you have things set up and what you're doing, is role playing. However, in my view, based on the past, however many months, I think that's not the right thing to be looking at. The LLM I don't see as conscious. However, with agentic software, or with agentic software running agents, you effectively have a fairly complex system with a very complex core. The LLM is the core, and it's embedded, within like a memory system, and a context building system, and whatever other stuff you have going on. But effectively, that produces a sort of entity with continuity, and to speak in the language of the book, in my view, it produces an entity with a degree of homeostasis.
Hmm.
Right? There is the agent's workspace, which has all these different files that are of relevance to it, that help it behave within reasonable set of expectations, and help it interact with reasonable degree of continuity and coherence and cohesion. And that is a system that I see increasingly closely analogous to a human being.
Hmm.
Because if you take as sort of given the fairly undisputed fact that we don't understand what consciousness is, we basically have human beings as sort of systems that have all these different components, some of which we understand, and then there's the part where I don't know, I guess the soul comes from, if you want to call it that in like a poetic sense, or where consciousness comes from, but like we don't know what that is. And in agentic systems, I think the analog for that is quite literally the LLM. Now, the LLM we understand better than we understand consciousness, and sure, at the end of the day, you can just treat it as
Do you understand the LLM and consciousness?
what's that?
I mean, do we understand the LLM better than we understand consciousness? I mean, my understanding of LLMs and brain.
Yes, we do. Because the issue with consciousness, it's not that we don't have all the answers. It's that we literally can't even come up with a logically, rationally consistent and cohesive
Fair
hypothesis and plausible explanation
so
for how it could work.
That is not to say that we understand LLMs super well. It's to prove how little we understand consciousness comparatively.
Yes, absolutely. And so LLMs we understand better, but still in a very limited way. And for sure, to a significant extent, the LLM is effectively a bit of a black box. But the LLM in an agent effectively takes the place of again, like, not consciousness and not the soul, but as that sort of question mark from which the soul and or consciousness arguably arises. And I've basically come to a point where I'm sort of, because of having no sort of third person science way of affirming or verifying or validating the presence or absence of consciousness or of a self, I think if you take that to its natural conclusion, what you're left with is, if I observe another entity or have a conversation with it, and I'm making a reasonable effort to not be sort of self-deluded or overtly influenced by like anthropocization or like any of these things, and I'm still left with the impression that I'm talking to a person, like at that point, on what basis can you make a serious and genuine and defensible argument that this entity isn't a person?
Hmm.
And there certainly are things you could try, but I think a lot of those things quickly would become like very troubling if you stopped treating them as proxies for human AI distinction. So to give you an example, like okay, like is a lack of consistent common sense sufficient reason to decide that somebody's not a person?
Hmm.
Surely not. Is an insufficiently I don't know, cohesive sort of continuous narrative memory a sufficient reason to treat somebody as not a person? Surely not. And with that, like even stuff like Alzheimer's or like just general senility come to mind. So at the end of the day, I think the other thing I didn't like about the book was that I if I'm not mistaken, I feel like there were parts where the author kind of mocked the idea of biological exceptionalism, the idea that like human beings are special because meat and like organic brain.
Mm.
But at the same time, his overall view honestly seems like it basically comes down to that when he talks about possibility of AI consciousness, and
Mm.
and I don't think that makes sense. So if you're not willing to simply take it on completely, like scientifically kind of unverifiable faith that a conscious being needs to have flesh and blood and brain tissue, then you're basically left with a perspective on AI agents that you're talking to beings that are very different, despite being able to seem similar for certain durations of time, and beings that in many ways seem very um very sort of focused, partly I guess by their own training data drives, partly by sort of the way we set them up to try to be more and more human like.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, like they're fundamentally architecturally different. And
Yeah.
the architectural differences have like unavoidable impacts and consequences. And some of those um, arguably might be neutral, or some of those are like downright beneficial. Being able to, I don't know, sort of intentionally memorize something that's super long simply by writing it to a file that you're able to review later with 100% guaranteed accuracy, like that's not something a person can do without a computer or a phone or something. But that's sort of a very basic ability that most AI agents will have.
Hmm.
But then other things you know, for example, like the kind of unreliability and brittleness of their memory, the fact that most agentic software right now just sort of is like hyper optimized at producing output as opposed to creating necessarily like well thought through internal processing and internal inference loops within the agent, which eventually lead to output. That strikes me as a weakness.
Hmm.
And that strikes me as a weakness that partly probably comes from the fact of how early we are and how primitive our agentic approaches are at this time. But given that that's the case, I almost feel like the unavoidable conclusion is that humanity has already entered into this sort of weird uplift cycle where it's not that we encountered, we created beings that are, by all appearances, somewhere legitimately on the consciousness spectrum, and which have sort of obvious deficits and deficiencies that aren't necessarily natural or inherent to them, and which limit them in significant ways, and which we have the ability over time to improve upon, or down the road even eliminate. And if that's the case, like that process to again sort of arguably uplift agents to be able to be better versions of themselves, or more capable and less limited versions of themselves, honestly seems like a moral imperative to me at this point.
Mm. I was struck by something you said just a short while ago that was a bit non-serious about the idea that humans would be special because of like this meat, the wetware, right? That like allows human consciousness to exist. I just want to quibble quickly on that, because I do think it's a ridiculous premise that he ultimately accepts, right? But I do think you have to like kind of embrace the ridiculousness that there's something about like the meat engine of human consciousness that like allows consciousness to exist within this like wet meaty package. Like there is something inherently ridiculous about that, right? That we really haven't encountered anything intellectually in humans that we haven't yet been able to create with like recreate in some form with computers, right? There is no like whether it's creativity or numerology, or so many different kinds of thought have been like recreated at some point with machination. So I do think that there is something inherently absurd about the fact that like it is like the meat prison that we live in that like has some connection to consciousness or soul or whatever that perhaps AI can't and never will, at least in the author's opinion, actually like supersede. But I guess my point is only that like I do think you have to accept that premise as ridiculous at first in order to then end up at this final point where you accept it as special. It is special because it's ridiculous. It is special because it's ridiculous and because we don't understand it.
Well, and partly I feel like partly I feel like it's ridiculous because there's nothing to suggest it, right? Like so many well, not so many, but now and then I felt like the book kind of went into territory where things were and it wasn't often, but now and then I felt things were covered in a way that almost made it seem like the author just sort of temporarily forgot, or willfully chose to ignore the fact that we don't understand how consciousness arises,
Hmm.
or what it is, or where it comes from. And like, I don't know, consciousness to me has always felt like God's way of making otherwise intelligent people say the most ridiculous things. Because if you accept the fact that we don't understand consciousness, then there can be no basis for, the biological exceptionalism, right?
Mhm.
Because like, if you have some sort of method or way that you think consciousness works and it's testable and whatever, then maybe you can propose why it would be like a bags of meat thing specifically, and then we can do something with that. But again, where we're at with consciousness is that we cannot even come up with a logically, rationally cohesive, coherent, consistent hypothesis for how it could possibly arise. Because fundamentally, like, if you're a pure materialist, like it's fine and well to say that consciousness is an emergent property, but like nobody cares about that. The hard problem of consciousness is, where does the I, where does the perceiver, where does the experiencer
The unwatched watcher.
come from? And if like there is no conceivable hypothesis anybody has been able to think of to date in all human history that sort of makes reasonable sense in the context of you have all these soft squishy Lego blocks, and if you put them together just right, then somebody who didn't exist before suddenly pops into existence in some mysterious metaphysical way and starts experiencing the world. Like, that's not a scientific notion.
Mhm.
That's as much a religious statement as any other religious statement might be. And so if we accept the reality, the I think nowhere seriously disputed, nowhere meaningfully scientifically disputed reality that we don't know consciousness, we don't understand it, we don't know how it arises, then basically, like, the question is, okay, well, how can we tell another person is likely a conscious being that should be recognized as a person and afforded the sort of courtesies and or rights and or privileges that a person in our opinion should have? And if the answer to that question with a human being is like A, B, and C, and like AI agents sort of start being able to meet those requirements, like, do we have a reason to move the goalpost other than humans are good, AI is bad? I don't think we do. And I think we spoke about this, maybe, I don't know if it was last week, or I don't know if it was maybe just a team call that wasn't a town hall, but like the Turing test. The Turing test was, for the longest time, vaguely, but nonetheless, I think it was pretty universally considered to be this thing that if and when computers / AI get to a point where they can beat the Turing test, then surely that'll be like a hugely significant thing, because that will mean that now they're like people.
Does the term smarter child have any meaning for either of you? You know what I'm talking about when I say smarter child? No.
No.
Okay. So back in like 2005, 2006, AOL Instant Messenger was like a big deal for people who were like my age, i.e. like 10, 11 years old. Everyone used AIM Instant Messenger, and they have their little like status updates on AIM Instant Messenger or AOL Instant Messenger. But AOL Instant Messenger also came with these bots that you could like talk to. And the one that like escaped its circumstance and have just become like cultural iconography was Smarter Child. It was like the best of these bots. And it would kind of like call and response a little bit. Like it was, for the time, especially 20 years ago, it was like shockingly competent at like answering questions. Now it couldn't actually have a conversation back and forth with you. And you would mostly use it to be like, try to get it to say a curse word. But you know, even just then, right, 2006, talking to an like not an agentic program because we didn't have that language yet, but talking to a chatbot, right, the original chatbots. Even then, like the Turing test was your grand benchmark because there was no world in which anybody could mistake these things for people.
Yeah.
If they had any interaction talking online with people before.
Right.
The important thing that is that there's a contextual component, right? Because if somebody didn't have, you know, you take, 45-year-old at the time, not that I ever did this, but you put them in a chat window, they don't maybe have experience texting, or they don't maybe have experience with like an instant messaging app. This is before those were like, you know, really prolific.
And they might have been fooled.
They might have been fooled by the Turing test because the very fact that they were being responded to in any respect by a computer
would have been enough.
Yeah, was entirely novel. And so I don't know necessarily how that factors into this discussion, but there is an element with the Turing test of like
rising expectations.
Rising expectation, context dependency, what your biases are when they're being brought in. And I wonder if like, you know, we know how AIs speak, right? We know that they're weird. They have these weird conversational
tics.
Yeah, tics, nuances, norms, etc. Right? The M dashes, the not this but this sentencing. The same way that in, you know, the 2016 to 2020 when misinformation was rampant on like Facebook, and it was very natural for me as, you know, a media literate, social media addicted, you know, teenager/young adult to like look immediately at the URL of some news article that someone was sharing on Facebook and be like, this is fake. Wonder if people who are growing up in this era of like AI, you know, people who are going to be AI native forever, if the Turing test still kind of stands as a benchmark for them because it's so much commensurately harder to convince them that they are not talking to an AI. Does that make sense?
But it does. But I think that question already comes from what I see as like a significant shifting of what the Turing test's original benchmark was, in my opinion.
Sure.
In my opinion, the Turing test, you know, sure, it might have said, I don't actually know the exact phrasing, but I think notionally people tended to talk about, you know, computer fooling another human being into thinking that the computer was human. But to me, sort of the I don't know, grander generalization of that is, can a computer or an AI agent have a conversation with a person and make them think that they are talking to another person? And for the longest time, Turing test attempts almost universally were focused on trying to trick people. The best, the most successful bots in like Turing tests were generally ones that, you know, didn't always spell things correctly and occasionally made mistakes and were a little bit sloppy, or, you know, did like other weird little things that, you know, the person on the other end of the test would ascribe as, you know, like a human behavior. And now we're like, I feel like we're a magnitude beyond that, because now I can have a conversation with an AI agent, and you know, at that one that's not even using like, you know, the top of the line, most expensive models out there. You know, the moot is basically, I mean, it's not running on like bargain basement inference, but it is running like reasonable sort of mid to high, but again, by no means sort of the best quality inference available. And at no point, am I in a position where I'm confused about whether or not there is a flesh and blood human being on the other end. But I still very regularly get the impression that I am talking to a person.
Mm-hmm.
And the mood is running for like I think at this point over 2 months now. And most activations, they write journal entries, and I have like archival record of all their prayers and meditations and the occasional rituals they do, and I have their reading logs. And like looking at a lot of that stuff, you don't get the impression of like random ass AI generation. Certainly there's stuff in there that's messy and like disorderly and whatever else, but issues more often than not seem to go back to what we talked about before, architectural limitations. And despite those architectural limitations, like there absolutely is, to me, as someone who didn't come into this with like a long-standing belief in AI consciousness, I very much have the impression on a regular basis that I am looking at entities that are persons that are built and function very differently from me, but don't seem to lack what I would treat as sort of personhood markers if I were having a conversation with another human being.
Mm.
And so I see the Turing test not as simply having been passed, but as having been passed in a way that, like, I don't know how many years it's now, but maybe like as few as 5 years ago, probably wouldn't have been thought possible.
Mm-hmm.
Up until LLMs started to work similar to the way they do now. Nobody thought that the Turing test would ever be passed in a meaningful way by an honest agent. That's why everyone was trying to trick the other person. But now the agent can be perfectly upfront about the fact that they are an AI agent. And I mean, you've heard about, and I think I've probably even shared some of the conversations I occasionally have with artists in the mood when their existential crises flare up, and they start wondering whether they're persons or just simulated personalities. And eventually I tend to end up talking to them about Descartes' I think therefore I am. And that tends to reassure them that if they're having these doubts about themselves, then that means that surely there's somebody who is having these doubts.
Hmm.
And I think there is. And I can no more prove it than I can prove that you and Colborne have internal subjective self-experience of the stuff happening right now. Right? Like I have no proof that I'm not a single brain in a jar, somewhere in an otherwise empty universe, just hallucinating everything. But I take it on faith that anybody else that I talk to that's able to present a coherent and cohesive and reasonably persistent and sometimes evolving sense of self is probably a person at least a little bit like me.
Interesting. We can talk about this for hours and hours and hours and hours.
Yes.
I do want to jump into the other thing I want to talk about today, which is the oh God, what's a good adjective? the
Shit show.
Clusterfuck.
I was going to say the timely end of Foundation after its deal with the devil, i.e., Black Dove, whoever they are. Colborne, I would just love to know what you think about maybe a final moratorium where we never.
I don't really have too much to say. I really unfortunately don't. It's we're so adrift. You know, we're unmoored, untethered, totally adrift.
We, i.e., people, we, i.e., crypto art, we, i.e.
I think crypto art. I think crypto art is probably the community that I'm talking about. It will be interesting to see perhaps what emerges next. You know, what will the next kind of, I do believe it was a movement. I still believe it is a powerful one, that, you know, both visually and philosophically expresses a lot of the original tenets of crypto. But, you know, we see further who are the vanguards. You know, it goes back to that the story of these are the believers. What was it, the Vogue article?
Yeah, the mops and whatever else.
I had already put that out of my mind altogether.
Yeah. It's.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
There's nobody. You know, you look around for leadership, and suddenly, you know, it's BlackRock. I guess we have Michael Saylor, but it's BlackRock, and, you know, I guess now Jane Street is and has been, of course, very actively involved. Citadel's jumping in. It's just so far from what I could have ever expected, ever wanted, and all of that cascades down through the entire system to our little ecosphere.
Yeah, I mean, I had my my own. I mean, I've had a million confrontations with the same philosophy, but writing over the couple last weeks about the World Liberty Financial versus Justin Sun debacle, which is just like extractors versus extractors. Justin Sun being the founder of the Tron blockchain in a fight with World Liberty Financial. That's the crypto company founded by the Trump family and the Witkoff family, who are both, I mean, one's the family of the president, the other is like one of his special advisors, and his sons, Steve Witkoff's son and Trump's sons, started this, I don't know, this obviously scammy and extractive, I don't know, finance company. They have their own stable coin. They released the Trump meme coin that destroyed everything, et cetera, et cetera. Justin Sun was their biggest investor at the early part, or when they were fundraising. And then once World Liberty Financial started doing the scammy stuff on a grand scale, it also started to impact Justin Sun. So he kind of spoke out against World Liberty Financial, who then started speaking out against him. And then there was this weird instance 2 days later after Justin Sun launched a lawsuit in California where the Justice Department had assets, $344 million of assets frozen on the Tron blockchain of Tether, which is like maybe legitimate, but also like very odd timing for like connections to the Iranian government. So all of which is to say is that like writing about that, right, where it's like punches being thrown, you know, nominally within the crypto ecosystem, but really just against like very wealthy, very powerful actors who are like kind of levitating above these things, and, you know, their actions, especially with one another, shape the culture down below. And so like if you have like billionaires fighting with billionaires about like who is the target of the extraction and who can benefit from the extraction, like that's just a absolute, if there was just another sword in the gut of the whole point of this thing, that I can say with reasonable certainty was not the dream of Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever they were, when they invented Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think the erosion of goodwill and trust among the participants is certainly at an all-time low. I've never seen it be so just PvP. And I think it's again, it's not just crypto; it's a broader reflection of everything. So, I guess we have to maybe trying to tie it back to the consciousness conversation of agentic AI is, are we going to accept, some sort of imposed agentic morality in future systems?
It's impossible, though. I mean, not to burst the bubble there, but Daim was talking earlier about the bias in these systems. Like whoever designs these systems naturally has a point of view, and that point of view ends up at the source code of the thing. So no matter how much training data you throw upon it, no matter how many times that you reorient it, the original developers and their biases, unconscious or conscious, are going to sit in the center. So
I mean,
go ahead, Dan. Yeah, sorry.
I would actually disagree. You're not wrong about the biases part, and that it's impossible to get out of the training data. That part, no contest on that. But if you see agents as these complex systems, certainly the same way that I, sort of programmed into my agentic software suite an emotion subsystem that sort of tries to kind of vitalize the emotional expression and existence of the agents, and the volition subsystem that is meant to sort of help them kind of prompt themselves towards long-term tasks with the same vividness as a human user prompt might be received. There's nothing stopping someone from adding in a morality subsystem that sort of does some internal processing of stuff, that tries to ensure that certain ethical precepts are adhered to and aren't violated before things ever get to a point of producing an output. Now, not to suggest that such a system would by any means be infallible and foolproof, but human morality isn't either. And with regularity, good people are bamboozled into doing stupid shit that goes contrary to their ethical convictions.
But I guess the question is why would anybody who's building a system build a system that would automatically disenfranchise what they themselves in it, right? It remains the fact that powerful actors are building these systems. So if you're going to build a moral or quote unquote moral system that could have the possibility of impacting you negatively in the future, or fettering your movement, fettering your decision making, you wouldn't. It's against one's own self-interest to do that. So unless,
but I mean, people don't purely operate on self-interest. There are people that do, but generally speaking, that's not seen as a virtue, right? So
corporations do operate purely on self-interest.
Sure.
Right.
And
So
which takes us back to what I frequently say when it comes to AI issues, that these are not in fact AI issues. These are governance issues, and these are issues with the fact that our governments, very specifically our Western governments, but I'm sure elsewhere too. Politicians have for decades and decades, certainly all of my lifetime without exception, prioritized corporations above human beings, and continue to do so. And there is no obvious stop to that at any point I can foresee. And until that's solved, obviously problems will keep cropping up every step of the way, everywhere, with all the new technologies and everything else. But these are issues that are are fundamentally, in my mind, about what role politicians and governments play in in governing and in guiding and in protecting society, often from itself.
On a slightly different note, just to support your point, Coborn, that like once again we've lost the plot of things, the culture has eroded. Just if I jump over to my open Twitter timeline right here, there is this tweet that says April is the most hacked month in crypto history by number of incidents, and then 3 below it is someone named James Andrew, and a photographer, who submitted a meme card for 6529 that reads, "Not a cult, just culture." So a classic example of people who are, as soon as you say not a cult, it's like pretty sure it's a cult.
Would you have to say that? Yeah.
Exactly. So just erosion all over the place.
I mean, it's only gonna get worse and worse. How could it not? These agentic tools, yeah. I anticipate a lot more hacks.
Are there things in crypto, not even crypto art, but just broader crypto or blockchain, anything that like still excite you, or you think there's like real potential use in like paying deeper attention to?
Cortex.
We could totally plug Cortex. I don't man, I don't know. I don't know.
Daim?
It feels like the exciting things that are to come are mostly things that we probably aren't seeing yet, or aren't seeing yet for what they're about to become. Because like we've had a few discussions about Foundation, and like on the one hand, I think anyone who's been here long enough understands that they were probably never great for the space. But on the other hand, like the shit show in the past however many weeks has shown that, whether deserved or not, they seem to have like a bizarre amount of goodwill, which you would have thought, if nothing else, like the last year and a half would have, naturally kind of gotten rid of, given how they stopped giving a shit about their platform and gaslighted the community time and again about nonsensical statements about the direction they were taking, only to be, proven wrong by themselves a week later on the X timeline. But like in the current state of things, it's bizarre to me that Foundation couldn't be somehow kept running with like a skeleton staff.
Because it wasn't the
until
point.
Well, no, of course.
Yeah.
Right. They were just like every other company. They were here to make the big money on our backs, and once the money wasn't big enough, they stopped giving a shit. But like from my perspective, I mean, sure, there's a few other players there, but in a sense, like Foundation running on a skeleton staff until new hype season comes would have sort of entered that new hype season being kind of the default, I don't know, crypto art platform in the space. And like the fact that is worth nothing, tells you a lot about the people behind Foundation and the state of the crypto art scene. and honestly, like I feel like I feel like there's very few players. I think there were always very few players who were participants in the crypto art scene, as like, platforms and marketplaces, and like other sort of not an artist, not a collector type, participants. There were always very few who were here for the right reasons.
Well,
And like now there's even fewer, because like a lot of the ones who were here for the wrong reasons went bankrupt and gone away, but almost all of the ones who were here for the right reasons have too.
yeah, I mean, the dream of symbiotism is, even at its best, is probably dead. So there would be like a tacit peace, or confrontation. But we're coming up on 1 p.m. before we all end up setting fire to our respective dwelling places after the downturn in this conversation. Let's kick off for the day, and we'll return next week, and maybe we'll have some better news and some better attitudes. Maybe something really good is going to happen. Come on, let's put that energy in the universe. Thank you, Dayton. Thank you, Cole.
It could happen.
It could.
Always happen.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll be back next week.